I'm Mark Price. I'd like to talk to you today about God versus man, or Theo versus ego. But first, there was a young girl sitting on her grandfather's lap, and she was looking at his face and playing with all the wrinkles all over his face, and she says, "Grandpa, did God make you?" And the grandfather smiled and he said, "Oh yeah, he made me, but he made me a long time ago, many years ago." And then she thought and she said, "Well, Grandpa, did God make me?" And he looked at her and he says, "Yes, God made you. That's why you're so beautiful." And the little girl smiled and she said, "God is getting a lot better, isn't he?" So today we will hear from the readings, I think, a story of God versus man. God saying this is how it should be, and man trying to say, no, we want it our way, not your way. Since the beginning of time, the whole problem we have had in our lives, in the existence of mankind, has been in that tug of war between us wanting it our way and God saying, you need to do it my way. God gave us free will, and so often we use our free will to go in the wrong direction. So in the readings today, the first reading is from Numbers. We hear the story of Moses in the desert. He's been leading the Israelites out of Egypt, and he's getting tired. He's getting kind of frustrated because they keep complaining. They're hungry, they want food, so Moses goes to God. God gives them the quail in the desert. They're thirsty. Moses goes to God. God gives them the water springing up out of rocks. They say that they want bread, and so Moses goes to God, and God gives them manna in the desert. Everything they're asking for, Moses is going to God and taking care of. And Moses is getting frustrated by their constant bickering and complaining. And Moses goes to God and says, "I need help." So God says, "Well, I'm going to take the spirit that is on you and I'm going to share it with 70 others. I'm going to put the spirit of God onto 70 others so you will have helpers." And Moses says, "This is great." So the day came and they had the celebration to basically confirm or anoint or pray over, ordain, whatever phrase you want to use or term you want to use, those 70. All of them were in the tent to be commissioned, except for two, Eldad and Medad. They did not make it to the tent. Instead, they remained outside the tent with all the people, and they were prophesying. They were doing the work of God. And some people went to Moses, including Joshua, who was his aide, and said, "Moses, you got to do something." He says, "We've all been commissioned. We're allowed to preach. We're allowed to talk about God. The other two were supposed to be here, but they did not get commissioned, and yet they are out preaching. You must stop them." And Moses says to them, he says, "I wish that the world were preaching the word of God. I wish that the world would be preaching who God is, what God is all about. We will not stop them because they are operating in the Spirit. The Spirit is on them." You see, so often man wants us to do it their way. We put ourselves in little boxes. We create these little labels around all of us. The world does it. We do it to ourselves. And we say, if you're not part of our group, if you're not part of the way we do it, then you can't do it. And Moses is saying, knock that off. It is better if the entire world were preaching, whether they are with our group or not. The second reading today from James is in some ways a follow-up from last Sunday. You remember last Sunday, St. James said that ambition is not bad unless it is selfish ambition, and then it's bad. And today we hear that wealth is not bad. He says, "Woe to those who are wealthy." Wealth is not bad as long as it's not selfish wealth. In other words, if we are taking our wealth that we work hard for and we're using it just for ourselves, for our own pleasures, for our own gratification, self-gratification, and we are ignoring the issues that exist around us, the poor, the hungry, the needy. If we are treating our own employees poorly by not paying them properly or a fair wage, it is not having wealth, James says, that is a problem. It is how we use that wealth, our focus on the wealth. Is the wealth more important than God? is wealth more important than the things that we can do with that wealth for the people of God? So James today, a follow-up from last week where he talked about selfish ambition being bad. Today we hear selfish wealth is bad. And then in the gospel today from Mark, it really connects to the first reading from the book of Numbers. Many times the first reading from the Old Testament is chosen to complement the gospel, and that's what it does today. So in the gospel reading today, we find Jesus and the apostles continuing on their journey. They had gone from Capernaum, they went up to the Mount of Transfiguration, and now they're coming back toward Jerusalem for Jesus's entry eventually into Jerusalem on that donkey on what we call Palm Sunday. And Jesus has taken this time to teach them. And you will remember for the last few weeks, Jesus has been trying to tell them who he was and what was going to happen, that the Son of Man would suffer, would die, would be arrested, and would rise again. And they weren't paying attention. They were more focused on themselves. Again, Theo versus ego. Self, they're selfish and focused on themselves rather than on God and the things of God. And so, for example, you remember over the last few weeks, they said, which one of us will be at your right hand, Jesus? And Jesus says, I'm telling you, I'm going to die, and you're worried about who's going to be at my right hand? You don't know what you're asking for. And then last Sunday, you heard them say, which one of us is the greatest? And Jesus is saying, aren't you paying attention to me? You're not ready yet. And so today's gospel, the teaching continues. And one of the apostles, or a couple of them, go to Jesus and say, we have people out there who are in the towns and the villages, and they are prophesying and they're healing and they're teaching in your name, Jesus. We must go and stop them. Please go and stop them. They're not part of us. They're not part of our group. They're not part of our inner circle. And Jesus says, if they are not against us, they are with us. Just like Moses saying, I want the whole world to preach in the name of God. You see, we make a mistake when we try to control God, when we try to control the Spirit of God. God puts his Spirit in all of us. It's up to us to say yes to that Spirit, to say yes to God working within us. God has called all of us to proclaim the glory of his Son, not just because we're a member of this group or that group. We, as human beings, we keep wanting to put God in a box. We want God to be our version of God, and we want to put ourselves in a box, or we want to put other people in a box. If they're not part of my religion or my faith or part of my group, if they didn't have my training, then they can't be any good. They cannot do the work of God because they don't have what I have. They're not having the same label I have. They're not in the same faith block that I'm in. And even me, I'm born and raised Catholic. Was baptized in 1956. This is my 50th year in ministry. I started ministry in 1974. And even with me, within my own faith Catholic, there was a time early on where I was discerning becoming a priest. I decided that that's not how God was calling me, but I never stopped serving him. I never stopped in ministry. But I found that what I had in the way of gifts, what God gave me in the way of gifts, what he called me to do, did not fit in with my own church's scope of what ministry was. I was sort of outside their box, and I didn't fit in. And many times over the years, many different priests, many different pastors, many different people in the church have labeled me. They said, well, Mark's too conservative, or Mark is too liberal. And so I didn't fit into, even though I was Catholic, and I think I'm a decent Catholic, I didn't fit into their brand of Catholicism. One time, years ago, probably 30 years ago almost, I had been asked to participate in something called ISOC, International School of Christian Communication. It was put on by Dr. Robert Schuller at the Crystal Cathedral, which, by the way, is now Christ Cathedral, part of the Catholic Church. But at the time, it was founded and operated by Dr. Robert Schuller, who was Dutch Reform. And so I participated in those seminars, those classes, for a couple of years. And then they asked me if I would teach there, if I would teach preaching in the first person. In other words, what I do in performing my characters of Peter and Judas and the rest of them, I'm actually preaching in the first person as them. So the people up at the Crystal Cathedral asked me if I would teach that as part of their preaching school. And I said, yes, I would. So I had involved myself up there with them. In my 50 years of ministry, I've never turned down anybody, not one church. I don't ask who you are or where, what you believe. If I'm invited to go to speak or to perform or to preach, I go. If we can work it out in my schedule, I go. Because I believe that God, when He calls us, He gives us gifts. He didn't give us gifts just for this group or just for that group. He gave us our gifts and asked us to proclaim the glory of Jesus to anyone and everyone who would listen. So I involved myself up there. Well, I was called on the carpet by a nun in my diocese of San Diego. She was head of some entity within the diocese. I don't remember what her title was. And she started to call my Catholicity into question me as a Catholic, because of the involvement I had up with the Crystal Cathedral. And by the way, whenever I would go to any other church, any other group or organization, they always knew I was Catholic. I always let them know. In fact, Robert Schuller, Dr. Schuller, called me many times his token Catholic. So they always knew I was Catholic. Again, proclaiming Jesus, but never forgetting who I am and what my base foundational faith is. So this nun is basically chastising me for my involvement in my work up at the Crystal Cathedral. And I says, well, sister, I said, I appreciate what you're saying, but I said, if you're going to call my faith into question because of my preaching or teaching up at the Crystal Cathedral, then you must drag in here also Bishop Fulton Sheen, who also preached at the Crystal Cathedral. You need to bring in here Cardinal Mahoney, who also preached at the Crystal Cathedral. You must drag into this carpet also Father Henry Nouwen, a great priest. One of his best books was The Wounded Healer. You need to bring him in, sister, and tell him that his Catholic faith is wandering because he preached at the Crystal Cathedral. You see, we, even within my own Catholic faith, we create lines, we create boxes. You have to do it my way or no way. And that's wrong, because that's not God. God versus man. God gives us gifts. God gives us the Spirit. It's up to us to say yes to God and to fulfill God's will for us on this earth. And by the way, not to just pick on my own church, as I said, I've always been open to going to any church that invites me, and many times to Baptist or Pentecostal churches, Seventh-day Adventist, a lot of churches. And once I was at a evangelical church, and I was invited to do two sermons on Sunday morning at two of their services, a 9 a.m. service and an 11 a.m. service. And people who were members of the congregation had saw me before and liked what they saw, and they talked their pastor into bringing me in. So I show up Sunday morning early, I get dressed, I'm going to perform St. Paul for them. Well, I do the first service, and somehow between the first and the second service, somebody told the pastor that I was Catholic, probably me in conversation. And from that moment on, he never talked to me. He wouldn't talk to me, he wouldn't look at me. He even had somebody else come and give me my fee, my stipend for being there. So they turned against me, not because anything I said as St. Paul in my sermon was wrong or bad or contrary to their beliefs, but simply because I am Catholic. We have to be people who stop judging people and putting people in boxes and labeling them. We have to realize that God is in charge. God has given us all talents and gifts. God gives us the Spirit, and we need to act on the Spirit. When we don't act on the Spirit is when we are doing something wrong. So be people who are proud. If you are a person who is called by God to serve, remember that the very first evangelist was a woman, Mary Magdalene, who Jesus appeared to after his resurrection and said, "Go and tell the others." So we have to remember God calls us not by man's standards or by man's rules, but by God's rules. Gives us the Spirit to fulfill. So if you have gifts, if you have talents, and you believe God has called you, go. And if you get turned down, do what the gospel says, shake the dust. I've shaken the dust off my feet from many Catholic churches, many Protestant churches, doesn't matter. I keep going, I never stop. When COVID hit and I couldn't go into churches, I stayed at home and started making these videos. So I never stopped. If God calls you, fulfill His will in your life. Discern that will and follow through. And don't worry about what other people call you or how other people label you. It says in the readings today that if you're not speaking against Jesus, then you're for Him. Moses said, I wish the world would preach. So let us be people who use our gifts, who use our talents to spread the word of Jesus Christ to all who will listen. Amen? This is Mark Price. Thanks for listening.